The morning Victoria Langston officially took over as chief executive of Meridian Transaction Solutions, she walked into the operations center and found a man asleep at his desk. His head rested on his crossed forearms. Around him, 36 monitors ran live. Transaction queues scrolling at machine speed, amber alerts stacking in columns, log outputs cycling through data that meant nothing to her without the language to read it. She did not stop to learn the language. She did not tap his shoulder and ask how long he had been there. She did not spend a single second looking at the screens before she looked at his face. She looked at his badge, read the name on it, and said it out loud for the entire floor to hear. What happened in the next 60 seconds would cost Meridian Transaction Solutions more money than any cyberattack in the company's 11-year history. And it would cost Victoria Langston something that no dollar figure could express. The clean certainty that she was the kind of leader who never made a mistake she hadn't seen coming. But to understand how that morning arrived, we have to go back. 48 hours back. To a man named Nathan Cole, working alone in the dark, holding an entire company together with his bare hands, while everyone around him slept peacefully, not knowing he was the only reason they still had jobs to wake up to. Meridian Transaction Solutions had its headquarters in a low, wide building on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, the kind of building that announces nothing about itself. No glass atrium, no branded fountain. Just 4 floors of servers, engineers, and a business model that processed the payment infrastructure for credit unions, regional banks, and mid-market corporations across 14 states. The systems ran 23 hours a day, with a single hour each week reserved for what the operations team called routine maintenance. Real downtime, the kind that clients could actually feel, was considered a failure event, and failure events at Meridian cost a minimum of $40,000 per hour in contractual penalties before you started counting the reputational damage. Nathan Cole had worked there for 9 years. His title was Infrastructure Systems Architect, which was the kind of title that sounds impressive to people outside the field and communicates almost nothing to anyone inside it. The people who worked beside him had a different set of words for what he did. They said he was the person you called when the system started doing something that nobody else could read. They said he could trace a fault through a legacy code base the way other people follow a smell through a house, room by room, wall by wall, until he found the source. They said he had the architecture memorized, not the way people memorize a document, but the way people memorize their own neighborhood. He didn't need to look up which path went where. He already knew. He was 36 years old. He wore the same style of things every day, a dark Henley, worn canvas pants, lace-up boots that had been resoled once. He kept a coffee mug on his desk from a diner in Zanesville that had closed years ago. He never talked about it. He refilled the mug 6 or 7 times a day, and never mentioned the diner or what it meant. Outside of work, Nathan was raising his daughter, Mara, 19 years old, enrolled in her first year at Ohio State. She called him every Sunday evening at 7:14, 7, not 7:15, 7:14, the time that had somehow drifted into habit without either of them choosing it. He never missed those calls. On the nights he had to work late, he called her from the parking lot before he went back inside. His wife had died 4 years earlier. A pulmonary embolism without warning on an ordinary morning in November. He didn't talk about that either. There was a second coffee mug on the shelf behind his monitor that he never used and never moved. People who had worked beside him long enough knew not to ask about it. He was not a man who cultivated visibility. He didn't go to the quarterly all-hands lunches. He didn't send emails about his accomplishments. He didn't explain himself to people who hadn't asked. What he did quietly, and the results of it were so consistent that after a while the company stopped noticing them, the way you stop noticing that the lights always come on. On the second Tuesday of March, at 11:37 in the evening, Nathan noticed something wrong. He had been running a diagnostic on a batch of international settlement files when a cluster of authentication requests caught his eye in the monitoring queue. They were small. Frequency too low to trigger any automated threshold, pattern too irregular to look like normal traffic at first glance. But Nathan had been reading this system's behavior for 9 years. He knew the rhythm of it, and these requests had the wrong rhythm. Not wrong like an error, wrong like something that was trying very hard to look right. He traced them backward through the log. It took him 40 minutes to find where they were coming from. A secondary relay node at the outermost edge of the architecture. A handler for a subset of cross-border verification requests that processed a narrow range of transactions and was supposed to be among the lowest priority components in the entire stack. Someone had found a door in the part of the house no one was watching. They had been inside for at least 72 hours, and they were not there to break anything. Not yet. They were mapping, testing what that relay could reach, building a route, slowly and carefully, toward the payment routing core. Nathan understood what this kind of intrusion meant. He had seen the aftermath of similar attacks at other institutions, the delayed triggers, the sleeper mode payloads that sat invisible in system memory until the right moment. He escalated immediately. His direct supervisor was a man named Greg Finch, who listened to Nathan's summary on the phone with the specific silence of a person receiving bad news at a bad time. The company was 2 days away from its most significant leadership transition in a decade. The outgoing president had been managing a quiet retirement for months, and the new CEO, Victoria Langston, hired from outside, backed by a private equity consortium that had taken a position in the company 18 months earlier, was scheduled to take the helm Thursday morning. A security incident report filed the night before her arrival would land on her desk before she had located the bathroom. Greg's message was dressed up in careful language, but the content was clear. Continue monitoring. Document everything. Don't file anything formal until we know more. Don't create alarm before we understand the scope. Nathan understood what he had been asked to do. He did not comply with the spirit of it. He could not take the compromised relay offline. The system interdependencies were too layered and too old, and a cold shutdown of that component would cascade in ways that could not be predicted or corrected in time. So he did the next thing. He began building manual isolation barriers around the segments he had identified as touched. Redirect logic that absorbed the suspicious traffic and shunted it into a controlled observation channel without triggering visible errors. Patches applied node by node, in sequence, on a live system, with no safety net beneath him. The work was the most technically demanding thing he had done in 9 years. Not because any individual fix was beyond him, but because he was doing all of it simultaneously, on architecture that had been accumulating its own history since before he arrived, with connections and dependencies that existed not because anyone designed them, but because someone, years ago, had built a solution to a problem and never cleaned up after themselves. Pulling any piece of it, without understanding, all of it was how you caused the failure you were trying to prevent. He worked through Wednesday night without leaving the building. He caught 2 hours of sleep on the break room couch at 3 a.m. and was back at his console by 5:15. He ate from the vending machine in the second-floor corridor. He changed his shirt in the bathroom near the server room. A few colleagues who were in and out of the operations floor during the overnight saw him there and registered his presence with the vague familiarity of a person who has always been part of a room. No one asked what he was working on. No one had the screens around him. No one thought to. At 9:47 Wednesday night, he found the thing that changed everything. Buried inside the primary processing cluster, not in the compromised relay, but deeper, somewhere it should not have been possible to reach from outside, was a dormant trigger. It was small and it was patient. It would not fire during normal operations. It would not show up in any standard diagnostic. But if someone ran a system restart, the kind of maintenance restart the operations team performed regularly to clear accumulated memory load and resync services, the restart would wipe the session state where Nathan's isolation logic was running, and the trigger would activate. The moment that happened, everything Nathan had built would dissolve. The path through the relay would open. The attack would begin its operational phase. He wrote everything down. He built a file of documentation. The original intrusion point, the relay behavior, the isolation patches and their precise locations, the trigger mechanism, the conditions that would set it off, and an explicit instruction in plain English at the bottom. Do not run a standard system restart under any circumstances. This is not a performance issue. This is an armed mechanism. If I am not available, call me before touching anything. He left his phone number. He intended to walk the file directly into leadership first thing Thursday morning. He intended to make someone understand, whatever that required. He sat at the console watching the logs cycle, waiting for the morning shift to arrive, and at some point in that waiting, the 48 hours he had spent on his feet simply collected their debt all at once, and he put his head down for one moment and did not come back up. Victoria Langston had been awake since 5 a.m. She had studied the organizational charts and the Q3 financials during the car ride in. She had a list in her head of the things she intended to see and the signals she intended to send on her first day. She had been hired to modernize a company that the Equity Consortium believed was running on inherited habit rather than rigorous accountability. That was the job, and she intended to begin it immediately. She walked into the operations center at 7:52 in the morning as part of a self-directed walk of the building she had not wanted filtered through department heads. She wanted to see the company unmanaged, unpolished, real. She walked between rows of monitors and engineers finishing the overnight shift. She stopped when she reached the center console. A man in a dark Henley was asleep at his desk. Around him, the screens were alive with scrolling data. Amber indicators, multiple alert columns, log outputs cycling at speeds that would have taken her several minutes to begin interpreting if she had tried. She did not try. What she saw was a symbol. A person sleeping at the most critical station on the most sensitive floor of the company on the morning of her first day. The image fit so exactly into the story she had come here to change that she didn't look past it. She looked at the badge clipped to his collar. She read the name. She said it. Nathan's head came up. His eyes took several seconds to find focus. When they did, they landed on a woman he had seen in the company announcement photo from 3 days ago, standing over him with the specific composure of someone who has already made a decision and is now executing it. He said, "Before anything else, there's something wrong with the core payment cluster. You need to hear this before." She cut across him without raising her voice. "What I need on my first morning is not an explanation for why someone is sleeping in the operations center. Security, his access card, please. HR, I want termination paperwork initiated within the hour." Nathan looked at her, not with anger, not with desperation, with the specific quality of attention someone gives to a preventable disaster they can see arriving and cannot stop. He tried once more, the restart command. If anyone runs a standard restart, I've said what I needed to say. A security officer was already approaching. Around the floor, a dozen engineers who had been on shift for the last several hours said nothing. Several of them had watched Nathan work through the night. 2 of them had been updated by him at around 3 a.m. on the general shape of the problem. Not one of them spoke. This was the new chief executive on her first morning, and the specific calculation of a person who has a mortgage and a family and a career that they cannot afford to put in front of a bus. That calculation ran through each of them in the space of half a second, and they all arrived at the same answer. Nathan removed his badge slowly. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not list what he had done. He looked at a junior engineer named Patrick, who was standing 6 feet away, with his eyes fixed carefully on a monitor he was not reading, and he said 4 words at a volume that carried to at least 3 other people. "Do not restart it." Someone assumed it was the parting remark of a bitter man. Someone else decided not to think about it. Victoria didn't register it as information at all. She had already moved on to the next item on her list. Nathan Cole walked out of the building at 8:09 a.m. in a wrinkled shirt without his badge, having not slept in roughly 46 hours, having told no one everything that was waiting inside the system he had just been locked out of. For 2 hours after Nathan left, the operations floor looked normal. The isolation layers he had installed were absorbing the irregular traffic quietly. The dashboards showed amber rather than red. To the supervisors joining Victoria's morning briefings upstairs, the system running calmly in the absence of the man she had fired confirmed the logic of the firing. If nothing had broken, there had been nothing critical to begin with. Victoria moved through 4 back-to-back department meetings, laying out her agenda in language that was clear and unambiguous. Accountability, modern standards, a culture that confused being comfortable with being competent would be corrected. Some people left those meetings energized. Others left with a low, wordless unease they couldn't organize into anything sayable. No one in those rooms had a clear enough view of what Nathan had been doing to know how to interrupt her. In the operations center, a handful of engineers who had worked alongside Nathan for years were quietly furious and just as quietly trapped. One of them had opened the repository folder where Nathan stored his technical files and was reading them at her desk, parsing the dense shorthand, finding warning annotations she didn't fully understand, finding explicit flags she understood exactly. She didn't know how to turn what she was reading into something that would make anyone upstairs change course. She closed the folder and opened it again and closed it again. At 11:43 in the morning, a processing cluster began showing elevated latency. The on-duty supervisor, a man named Harris who had held his position for 6 years and was good at his job, recognized the pattern immediately. Memory accumulation. The queues were backing up the way they backed up when session data had been running too long without a flush. He had run the standard maintenance restart for this exact condition dozens of times. It cleared in minutes. He typed the command. Patrick was standing 2 stations over. He looked at the command on Harris's screen. He said it quietly enough that it nearly wasn't said at all. He told us not to restart it. Harris glanced at him. He's been terminated. Patrick said nothing more. He looked back at his own monitor. He understood in a formless way that what he had just done, or rather not done, was something he would carry for a long time. But Harris's logic was the logic of the room, and rooms are hard to argue with from the inside. The restart executed at 11:51 a.m. In the first 90 seconds, everything improved. The queue cleared. Latency dropped back to baseline. Harris exhaled and made a note in the maintenance log. Then, at 11:53, the authentication tokens went out of sync. It happened in a wave. Transaction sessions began returning state mismatch errors. Payments flagged as uninitialized. Records showing as neither completed nor cleanly reversible. Timestamp discrepancies that made reconciliation algorithmically impossible. The restart had cleared the session memory where Nathan's isolation logic was running. The barriers dissolved. The dormant trigger fired. The relay pathway opened. And somewhere outside the network, the people who had been waiting for exactly this signal began the second phase of what they had planned. In the next 40 minutes, outbound transaction routing began silently redirecting a subset of corporate payment traffic toward endpoints outside Meridian's verified network. Reconciliation failed on a category of high-value batch settlements. Multiple transactions entered suspended states that the system's own monitoring tools could not classify correctly, because the monitoring tools were missing the bridging logic that was supposed to tell them what they were looking at. The engineers worked fast, and it wasn't fast enough. They attempted rollbacks, and the rollbacks didn't anchor because the system state they were trying to restore had never been formally documented. It had been a live construction, built by one person under pressure, which existed only in his memory and in the notes sitting in a repository folder that most people in the building had never opened. Victoria was pulled out of her 4th meeting at 12:34 p.m. She walked into the operations center, and the room she entered was not the room she had left. Every major display was red. Engineers moved between stations with the tight efficiency of people who know exactly how bad something is and are not wasting energy naming it. 2 phones in the room were ringing simultaneously with client calls that no one was picking up. She asked what was happening. A senior engineer named Louise turned from her console. Face pale, voice composed with the particular composure of someone who has decided to say the honest thing regardless of where it lands. The man you fired this morning had been holding the system together for 2 days. We ran the restart. Everything he built went down with it. Victoria stood still for a moment. She asked if they could fix it. She asked who understood the patch architecture. She asked where the CTO was and what his depth of knowledge on the legacy stack looked like. The answers she received were honest, and they were not good. The CTO was strong on strategy and thin on legacy operations. The engineers in the room were talented and working as hard as they could, and working at approximately 60% of the depth the situation required. Someone had pulled up Nathan's repository folder on the main console screen and was reading the technical notes aloud to the group. The notes described the current failure mode with an accuracy that was almost eerie to read in present tense. Understanding them well enough to reverse what was happening was a different problem entirely. Victoria sat down at an empty workstation and read everything Nathan had written. She read it from beginning to end. When she reached the bottom of the final page, she found a block of text in slightly larger font that had clearly been added last. after everything else. If I am no longer available, do not restart the core services under any circumstances. This is not a performance issue. This is a staged attack waiting to be triggered. Call me first. Below it a phone number. Nobody had called it. She sat with her hands flat on the desk for a moment. The feeling that arrived in her chest was not one she had words ready for, and she did not reach for words. She thought about Nathan's face when he tried to speak that morning. Not panicked, not angry, carrying the specific quality of a person trying to transfer something urgent across a gap that was closing faster than they could talk. She had not misread that face. She had not read it at all. She had seen what she expected to see and turned away before anything else could reach her. She picked up her phone. She called 3 times. No answer. She asked HR for his home address and drove herself there. The address was in a quiet neighborhood in Westerville. Older houses, wide front porches, a street where the trees had been growing for 40 years. She parked and sat in her car for a moment, registering the specific quality of the silence, the distance between this street and the operations floor she had just left. Then she walked to the door and knocked. No answer. She knocked again. She was reaching for her phone when the door opened. A young woman stood in the doorway, 20 or so, dark hair pinned up on one side, a textbook tucked under her arm. She looked at Victoria with the calm, assessing attention of someone who has learned to read unexpected visitors quickly. "Can I help you?" Victoria hadn't known there was anyone else in his life, not the way she should have. His personnel file had an emergency contact listed, a name and number, nothing more. She hadn't looked at it until an hour ago. The young woman opened the door wider when she decided the woman on the porch didn't seem threatening. "I'm Mara, his daughter." Inside the apartment, Nathan was lying on the couch on his side, still in the same dark Henley. From the morning, his jacket pulled over his shoulders, like a blanket, by someone who had done it gently. One shoe was off. The other was still on. A glass of water on the low table in front of him had not been touched. His laptop was open on the cushion beside him, lock screen cycling. He had the stillness of a man who had stopped, not because he decided to, but because there was nothing left. Mara lowered her voice. He got home around 9. He said something bad was happening at work. He said he was going to rest for an hour, and then handle it. He was asleep before he finished the sentence. She paused. He hasn't slept, actually slept, in 2 days. I could tell when he came in. Victoria looked at the apartment. The particular economy of it. The furniture that was functional and cared for. The bookshelves with books that had actually been opened. The second coffee mug on the shelf that was slightly apart from the others, positioned with a care that made it clear someone had put it there deliberately and left it there deliberately, and the space around it was never filled. She understood without asking what the mug meant. She thought about the image she had constructed in the 11 seconds between seeing him asleep and saying his name. The certainty she had felt. The complete and absolute wrongness of it. She touched Mara's arm briefly. "I need to wake him. I'm sorry. It took several minutes." Nathan came back to consciousness in stages. When he finally recognized Victoria standing in his living room, his first expression was not anger. It was something quieter and more exhausted than anger. The look of a man who has already given everything and is being asked to find more. He sat up slowly. He said nothing. Victoria sat in the chair across from him. She did not preface anything or arrange her words toward any particular effect. "I fired you this morning without hearing a single complete sentence from you. I was wrong. And because I was wrong, someone ran the restart you warned us not to run. The system is failing right now, and there is nobody in the building who understands it well enough to stop it. I need you to come back. I am asking you." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. He picked up the laptop from the cushion beside him and pulled up the remote monitoring interface. The metrics loaded. He looked at them for less than a minute before he set the laptop down on the table with a careful, controlled movement. He did not say anything about what he saw on the screen, but his jaw set in a way that said it plainly enough. He looked at his daughter, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, watching him with the composure of someone who has done this before. Watched him get called back to something difficult and decided not to make it harder. "Have you eaten? I made a sandwich an hour ago. You have class tomorrow morning? 8 a.m. He looked at her for a moment longer. Something moved between them that didn't need words and didn't use them. Then he looked at Victoria. His voice was even, and it carried the particular weight of a man who has thought about this question before and already knows his answer. I'm going back because the people those payment systems serve, workers, small businesses, credit union members in 14 states, they didn't make any of the decisions that led to this. They shouldn't carry the cost of it. That's the reason I'm going. Not the apology, not the job. He stood, changed his shirt, said a quiet goodnight to Mara, picked up his jacket and his laptop, and walked to the door. He looked back once. Mara gave him a small nod. Just a nod, nothing more. The specific nod of a person who trusts someone completely and is choosing not to show how worried they are. He held it for half a second. Then he pulled the door shut. When Nathan walked back into the operations center, the room did not cheer. Nothing like that. What happened was quieter and more specific. A group of people who had been working past their capacity for 90 minutes registered the arrival of the person who carried the capacity they were missing, and the collective tension in the room dropped by a fraction that could be felt without being measured. Nathan moved directly to the primary console. Someone vacated the seat without being asked. He asked for full log access, a verbal summary of every intervention attempted since the restart, and the current architecture diagrams. He listened to the summary without interrupting. When it ended, he was silent for 8 seconds. Not hesitating, thinking. Then he started distributing the work. He sent 2 engineers to isolate the anomalous outbound connections using a controlled observation approach rather than a hard block. He sent 2 others to build a mirror pathway tracking exactly where the redirected transaction data was being routed. He asked a 3rd pair to prepare a controlled failover for the highest value processing queue. He asked someone from the legal team to contact the 3 largest enterprise clients with specific scripted language that acknowledged a technical issue, without triggering the contractual escalation clauses. He asked Patrick to do nothing except record every command issued in order with timestamps. He asked Louise for a cup of coffee. The distribution of the work was a form of communication in itself. Nathan was not performing competence. He was executing a plan he had been developing inside his own head for 48 hours, adapting it in real time to a situation that had deteriorated faster than he had hoped. He understood the system the way only 9 years of continuous intimate contact produces. Not just how it had been designed to work, but how it had evolved away from the design, and what that evolution meant when the pressure came. Over the following 97 minutes, the bleeding stopped. The anomalous routing pathway was severed from the payment core through a sequence of 17 specific authentication configuration changes that closed the door the attackers had built and removed what they had used to prop it open. 3 suspended high-value transaction batches were isolated and quarantined before any funds transferred outside the verified network. The dormant trigger was located and diffused with a surgical deletion of 4 lines of code buried in a subsystem that no standard audit would have found. The reconciliation layer was restored. The monitoring systems came back into alignment. At 3:18 p.m., Nathan confirmed that the authentication layer had restabilized and the intrusion pathway was permanently closed. He leaned back in the chair and pressed both hands flat on the desk for a moment. Around him, the monitors cycled from red back through amber toward green. Nobody said anything for about 15 seconds. Then Louise set a coffee mug in front of him. Not the good mug, just a company mug, the kind that accumulates in break room cabinets, and went back to her station without comment. Nathan picked it up. The emergency review was called at 5 p.m. Department heads, the CTO, the board's risk liaison, and 2 members of the Private Equity Consortium's Operations Committee assembled in the 4th floor conference room. The incident report was presented in full. The rooms absorbed it in stages. The intrusion first detected by Nathan, 2 days before anyone else identified it. The escalation through proper channels that produced a request to wait. The 48 hours of solo defensive work on a live system. The termination on the morning he was planning to brief leadership. The warning dismissed by a supervisor operating on the logic that a fired employee's words carry no weight. The restart. The activation. The outcome. The language people reach for in rooms like this is a very specific kind of language. It distributes responsibility broadly so that no single failure point becomes the weight-bearing wall. Process gaps. Communication breakdowns. Understandable given the circumstances of a leadership transition. Victoria recognized the language because she had used it in other rooms, in other crises, for other people whose errors she had been called in to manage. She knew its function precisely. She stood up. This morning I terminated Nathan Cole before I had heard a complete sentence from him. I made that decision based on a visual that confirmed what I had already decided to believe. I did not investigate, I did not listen, and I did not ask a single question. That error triggered the cascade that followed it. I take responsibility for it directly, not as a process failure, and not as a communication breakdown. It was a failure of judgment. Mine. The room was quiet in the way that rooms become quiet when the true thing has been said plainly, and there is nowhere to redirect it. Nathan, seated at the far end of the table, gave a single nod. Not forgiveness, not yet, and maybe never entirely. But acknowledgement of something honest offered honestly, which is a different thing, and in some ways more durable. The board moved quickly on his professional standing. There were immediate offers. A newly created senior role overseeing infrastructure security and resilience, compensation adjusted to the level that his actual function had always warranted, and a formal recognition in writing of what he had done over those 48 hours. Before any title or number was finalized, Nathan presented 3 structural requests. He asked for a revised escalation protocol that gave frontline engineers a direct, unblockable path to executive leadership when reporting security-level concerns. He asked for shift coverage standards that made it structurally impossible for any single engineer to become a load-bearing wall through exhaustion. And he asked for a formal policy protecting any engineer who raised a genuine risk alarm from professional consequence for raising it. The room was very still when he finished. The board members present understood what they were looking at. A man who had been given significant leverage by the events of the last 36 hours and had chosen to spend most of it on policies that would protect the next person in his position from being destroyed the way he had almost been destroyed. Not on himself, on the next person. Victoria accepted all 3 without modification. Greg Finch submitted his resignation the following week, before the board asked for it. 2 members of the senior operations team, whose silence on the morning of the termination was reviewed in the incident, post-mortem, were placed on formal performance plans. Harris, the supervisor who ran the restart, was reassigned to a role without system-level authority pending a retraining certification. None of these consequences were administered with drama. They were administered the way consequences are administered when an institution is trying to be honest about what it got wrong. Victoria did not resign. She did not try to walk back the changes. She did not, in private, frame the events as bad luck or unfair timing. She stayed, and she led differently. The decisiveness remained. That was hers, and it was genuinely useful when aimed correctly. But something in the way she moved through the building shifted. She began arriving in departments, unannounced, not to inspect, but to ask questions. She learned to distinguish between the person who described their work loudly in meetings and the person who was quietly doing the thing that kept the meeting necessary. She got slower in the moments that called for listening. Not weak, slower. There's a difference, and it cost her something to learn it. It was a lesson that arrived with a price tag she hadn't budgeted for, which is the only way some lessons come. Several weeks after the incident had been formally closed, Nathan was leaving the building on a Thursday evening when his phone rang. He stopped near the front entrance and answered it. It was Mara, calling 20 minutes early, not 7:14, but 6:52. He answered the same way he always answered and stood there in the lobby talking to her, laughing once at something she said about a study group, asking 3 follow-up questions about a professor she had mentioned the week before, holding the phone the way you hold a phone when the call is the best part of your day. Victoria passed through the lobby on her way out and stopped when she saw him, not to approach, just to register. Nathan Cole on the phone, standing in the ordinary brightness of a lobby at the end of an ordinary Thursday, not in the operations center, not at a console, not holding anything together except a conversation with his daughter. His face, which she had memorized in 2 expressions, the urgent precision of a man with a warning to deliver and the shuddered exhaustion of a man who had been turned away, was neither of those things now. It was open, easy, the face of a man who has come through something and arrived, at least for this moment, somewhere he wanted to be. She waited until he had finished the call. When he lowered the phone, he found her standing a few feet away. She had an envelope in her hand. She held it out to him. He took it, opened it. Inside was a single index card. On it, a phone number and 4 words in her handwriting. "Call me first." Always he read it. He held it for a moment. Then he looked at her with the expression of a man who has decided that this was not the moment for complicated things. Only for the simple thing, which was to accept a gesture from a person who had meant it. He put the card in his jacket pocket. "Safe drive home," he said. "You too." She walked out. He stood there for another few seconds, looking at the door after she had gone through it. Then he checked his watch, picked up his bag, and walked out into the evening, toward the parking lot, toward the drive home, toward the Sunday call, 4 days away that would come at 7:14, as it always did, without either of them having decided on the time, only on the habit of showing up for each other. He had kept his daughter's old stuffed rabbit, a threadbare thing she had loved as a child, on the shelf in his apartment since she left for college. He hadn't told her he still had it. He didn't plan to. But some nights when the apartment was very quiet, he looked at it for a moment before turning off the light. That night was one of them. Sometimes the people a company cannot afford to lose are the ones it never bothers to protect, until the moment it nearly loses them forever. Sometimes the most important work in a building is happening at a station no one is watching, in the hands of a person no one is thinking to thank, at an hour when everyone else has gone home. And sometimes the most expensive mistake a leader can make is the one that feels, in the moment, like decisiveness. The one that feels so clean and so right and so obvious, until the moment the system it was built on starts to fall apart. Nathan Cole had been holding the walls up for 48 hours. He had been asked once, politely, to wait. He had been fired before he could finish a sentence. He had walked out without raising his voice. He had gone home, collapsed on his couch, and still come back when it mattered. Not for the apology, not for the job, but for the people at the other end of the systems he understood, and the woman who ran the company that had dismissed him did not. Dignity is not something a job title gives you. It is something you carry, quietly, in the dark when no one is looking, for hours and hours, until the morning arrives, and someone finally has the courage to look. If Nathan's story stayed with you, if it reminded you that a person's value has nothing to do with whether someone in authority was paying attention to it, then you already know what this story was really about. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated, only to discover who they really were? Share your story below. And if you want more stories like this, stories about ordinary people with extraordinary hidden depths, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.